Hello, Joseph Party, and today I'm going to be ranking Moto's archetypes from the original Yu-Gi-Oh anime. This being, I'm ranking each archetype that was spawned due to the existence of a card that existed in Moto's deck in the original series. The things that qualify a deck to be an archetype in this video is that they have to have at least 5 different cards, and at least one card that has something to do with the cards being part of an archetype. With the exception to this rule being that I am not including Exodia in this list, because outside of the 5 pieces of Exodia, there are not 5 other cards that really have to do with Exodia itself. Without further ado, let's get into the actual list. Number 9, worst of the worst, Summon Skull. Well, the strengths of this deck are Summon Skull has the same attack stat as Dark Magician, but for 1 less tribute. And the weaknesses of this archetype is that it doesn't actually make Summon Skull. There are no cards in this archetype that actually make Summon Skull. It's all extra deck monsters and a ritual monster for some reason. And even if you make one of them, you kind of have wasted resources because all the effects on all of these cards are terrible. It's not worth the effort it takes to make them. They all float into Summon Skull, but to make some of them, you need Summon Skull. And in the end, that comes down to the big problem of they all seem to want to have Summon Skull, but Summon Skull is just a vanilla, and that's something that this deck can't overcome. Up to number 8, BLS. This is a bit of a weird one because, as many of you know, there are very, very good BLS cards, but those cards have nothing to do with the actual archetype of BLS, which wasn't an archetype when some of those was printed, especially the BLS Envoy of the Beginning. The actual Black Luster Soldier deck isn't consistent, and that you'd be better off just playing good Black Luster Soldier cards and much better decks than trying to play the designated Black Luster Soldier deck. Up next, with number 7, we have Dark Magician Girls. Well, something good about this deck is that they can dodge attacks and put really strong cards on board, and they were pretty decent in Duel Links. The problem is they aren't consistent, and most of the Magician Girls themselves are susceptible to a lot of removal options that many decks have access to. And they just don't have the level of support that Dark Magician has. Up next, Silent Level. This is a bit of a weird one because it really feels like 2 different archetypes split it that have only one thing really holding them together. That being, well, 2 things. That being immunity to spells, sort of, and a really strange card called Silent Paladin that ties the 2 cards together, or the 2 archetypes together. They were originally 2 different sets of level monsters, Silent Swordsman levels 3, 5, and 7, and Silent Magicians level 4 and level 8. The good parts about the Silent archetype is that both parts were actually good enough to be meta in Duel Links for a period of time, because the support cards that surround at least the Silent Swordsman archetype, and actually to an extent the Silent Magician archetype, were actually pretty good. The problem is, outside of Duel Links, the decks aren't consistent. The end bosses have been power crapped in both the TCG and in Duel Links at this point. Up next, we have Kuriboh. Kuribohs are a fun one, because a lot of the individual cards have proven to be very solid in various TCG formats, such as Duel Links, Speed Duels, and the regular TCG format. Also, Kuriboh is very strong. Problems with this deck, though, is that the Kuriboh deck, while having many of the really good Kuriboh cards, was very reliant on actually being able to make Firewall Dragon, a card that has been long banned at this point. And Karibos are more of an archetype that is reliant on being being thrown into a better archetype rather than just being their own deck. Up next, we have number 4, Gaia. Well, there's not really much to say about this deck. The deck is very consistent with what it does, and that's OTK very easily. The problem is, the deck can't play first. It's like the deck had one thing in mind, and that was to try to be an OTK strategy, but there's a lot more resilient, more consistent strategies out there. It does pretty okay for itself, but all in all, it's not that great. But on to better decks, we have number 3, Magnet Warriors. This is a fun one. The strengths that this deck is very consistent, recursive. There's a lot of good rock support out there. It was really good in the speed duel format, which not a lot of people really know about. And Berserkion is a really good end boss. I played against this deck in my early days of coming back into the game, and it was pretty good. And the problem with this deck, though, is that even with a card as cool as Berserkion and the other Electromagnet Warriors that the deck now has, it's not good enough to beat what other decks are able to do. Might be cool, but other decks can be cooler. Number 2, Dark Magician. Well, it's the flagship card of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime and Yugi's deck. And it does have a lot of things, which puts it up to the number 2 spot. Strengths are, Dragoon is a card that exists. A very, very, very good card that exists. This archetype also has a lot of really good consistency boosting cards. And another really good thing about this deck is that it was very strong in Duel Links, and similar to that of the Silent Magician and Silent Swordsman archetypes, has also seen hits on the Duel Links ban list. It also has relatively recent regional tops in the TCG, back when that was a thing that happened. The problem with this deck is that most decks can make Dragoon easier than Dark Magician can, and also Eternal Souls is a necessary evil that you have to run in this deck for it to function, but at the same time, the destruction effect of Eternal Souls is terrible. And every time I have played a Dark Magician player at a locals level event, all I had to do was pop it and they lose on the spot. But up next with our final and best deck archetype that was spawned from Yugi Moto's cards, Buster Blader. This deck is pretty insane. It was a very powerful engine that is still even seeing play up in 2021. The boss monsters are very, very powerful, as well as incredibly powerful back row pieces. And it has quite a few high-level tops. The problem with this archetype, though, is that it did lose its Buster Lock, which, when it was being splashed with Dogmatica, didn't really actually need. But its other weakness is that it does usually require a side engine, such as Dogmatica, to be able to perform at its best. But otherwise, it is still a very powerful archetype. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have an excellent day.